1177. The scorching sands of the Levant trembled under the march of Saladin's great army, a living tide of steel and dust that seemed to stretch endlessly across the horizon. Tens of thousands of soldiers, banners snapping like burning flames in the desert wind, and war horses bred for conquest thundered forward with a single, terrifying purpose: to wipe Jerusalem from the map and end the Crusader kingdom forever. And standing in their path, barely 500 knights, exhausted from months of conflict, outnumbered to the brink of hopelessness, and led by a king already dying from leprosy. A 16-year-old boy whose body was betraying him piece by piece. Flesh decaying, nerves dying, pain constant, but whose will refused to break. He gathered what remained of his warriors, raised his banner high with hands wrapped in cloth to hide the sores, and charged straight toward Saladin's vast and seemingly unstoppable force. What followed was not a miracle of God as later storytellers claimed, but a miracle of courage, calculation, and unshakable resolve. A moment in history where willpower, timing, and terrain defeated overwhelming numbers. This was the day when 500 knights broke the army of Saladin. To understand the impossible odds at the Battle of Montcassard, you first have to understand the two men who shaped the destiny of that day. One was at the absolute peak of his power, a storm gathering speed. The other was a flickering candle in a hurricane, burning fiercely even as the wind tried to snuff him out. The first was Salah al-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub Saladin, a warrior statesman whose name carried the weight of empires. By 1177, he had risen with astonishing speed from a mere general to the Sultan of Egypt, uniting much of the Islamic world under his rule with a rare blend of brilliance, charisma, and religious conviction. Saladin wasn't just a conqueror hungering for territory. He saw reclaiming Jerusalem as a sacred duty, the culmination of years of political maneuvering and military preparation. He had forged a professional army unlike anything the Crusader states had ever faced, disciplined, loyal, hardened by desert warfare. Now, with his power consolidated and his enemies divided, he was ready to strike what he believed would be the decisive blow that would reshape the Middle East. And opposite him stood a boy king who should have been bedridden, forgotten, and powerless, yet instead held the fate of a kingdom in hands already losing sensation. His opponent was a tragic contrast, a living paradox of frailty and ferocity. Baldwin IV, the young king of Jerusalem. He had become king at just 13, an age when most boys of his time were still training for knighthood or learning courtly manners, not ruling a kingdom surrounded by enemies. But Baldwin carried a horrifying secret that threatened not only his life but the stability of the entire Crusader state. He had leprosy. In the medieval world, this disease was more than a medical condition. It was a sentence of isolation, fear, and slow decay, widely believed to be a divine curse. For a warrior king, it was catastrophic. Baldwin's hands were losing sensation. His fingers, once meant to grip a sword, were weakening. The nerves in his face were dying, leaving patches of skin numb and disfigured. And yet he refused to surrender to despair. He trained relentlessly, learning to control his warhorse using only his knees when his hands could no longer feel the reins, and becoming such a skilled rider that even seasoned knights marveled at him. His intelligence and political insight grew sharper as his body failed him, as if his mind were fighting to compensate for the betrayal of his flesh. His will was iron, and behind his calm, regal expression burned a determination as fierce as any battlefield flame. But willpower alone cannot defend a kingdom, and in late 1177, that kingdom stood on the edge of annihilation. Jerusalem was dangerously exposed. Its military stretched thin, its experienced commanders far to the north on a campaign in Syria that had collapsed into chaos. This ill-fated adventure had stripped the kingdom of its strongest knights and most capable leaders, leaving the southern frontier, the one closest to Saladin's power base in Egypt, nearly defenseless. Saladin, ever the master of timing, saw the opening with predatory clarity. He understood that the leper king was isolated, that the Crusader forces were fractured, and that the holy city lay vulnerable. The path to Jerusalem, normally shielded by disciplined Frankish forces, was now wide open, a door waiting to be kicked down. It was the perfect moment, a convergence of weakness and opportunity that generals dream of, and Saladin seized it without hesitation. His invasion was not just strategic. It was symbolic, intended to deliver a crushing blow that would break the Crusader kingdom before the Boy King could rally its scattered forces. In that moment, as Saladin's armies surged toward the border, the fate of Jerusalem balanced on the shoulders of a teenager whose body was breaking even as his resolve hardened into something legendary. It was a perfect opportunity, and Saladin launched his all-out invasion with the confidence of a man who believed fate itself was guiding his hand. His forces poured across the frontier like a tidal wave of steel and dust, sweeping toward the heart of the Crusader kingdom. When news of the invasion reached Jerusalem, the reaction wasn't mere worry. It was raw, suffocating terror. Chroniclers wrote that the city fell into despair, as if a great shadow had descended over its walls. And in truth, Saladin's army was a sight that could break the courage of even seasoned warriors. A massive, mobile force, possibly up to 20,000 strong, with around 1,000 elite Mamluks at its core. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were men forged from childhood in the art of war, trained in discipline, loyalty, and ruthless precision. They crossed the desert with unnerving speed, moving like a storm front of iron, their advance leaving villages trembling in fear. In Jerusalem, panic spread faster than hope. The kingdom's defenders, the hardened knights who normally stood as its shield, were hundreds of miles away. Yet King Baldwin refused to cower behind his walls or wait for rescue that might never come. In a desperate act of leadership that would define his legacy, he called for a general mobilization, demanding that every able-bodied Christian man, farmers, shopkeepers, laborers, take up arms for the defense of the kingdom. The response, however, was heartbreakingly small. Baldwin scraped together a force so tiny it seemed almost symbolic. According to William of Tyre, only 375 knights answered the call. With local infantry and militia added, the total force rose to somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 men, a threadbare army to face a desert tempest. They were the kingdom's last hope, the final line between Jerusalem and destruction. Most rulers in Baldwin's condition, young, sick, outnumbered, and facing one of the greatest commanders of the age, would have taken the safest option, retreating behind Jerusalem's formidable walls and praying for a miracle. But Baldwin was not interested in waiting for salvation. He understood something deeper, that once Saladin encircled the city, there would be no escape, no relief force, no second chance. So he chose the unthinkable. He marched out to meet the invasion head-on, refusing to let Saladin dictate the terms of the conflict. It was an act that seemed reckless to some, heroic to others, but in truth it was the only bold move left on the board. Baldwin set his sights on the fortress of Ascalon, a strategic bastion directly in Saladin's path. If he could reach it first and hold it, he might disrupt the invasion long enough to find an opening. The gamble was immense, and the moment he arrived at Ascalon, the first of Saladin's troops appeared on the horizon, forcing Baldwin and his small army to retreat inside the fortress walls. It seemed like a tragic ending in the making. Baldwin cornered, trapped, and surrounded by an enemy that dwarfed his strength. Yet fate, audacity, and the arrogance of a conqueror were quietly aligning to create the first crack in Saladin's flawless war machine. He had made the incredibly bold decision to march his skeleton force out to meet the invasion head-on. A choice that seemed like madness to every rational observer but made perfect sense to a king who understood that hesitation meant death. His target was the fortress of Ascalon, a massive stronghold that sat like a stone guardian directly in Saladin's path. A place where Baldwin hoped to buy time, gather strength, and somehow disrupt the unstoppable advance of the Sultan's army. But as his tiny force reached the gates, the first wave of Saladin's troops appeared on the horizon, their banners rippling in the desert wind like omens. Baldwin had no choice but to retreat inside the fortress, taking shelter behind its ancient walls. To outside observers, it looked fatal. The Boy King and his exhausted knights boxed in, isolated, and cut off from reinforcements. From Saladin's point of view, everything was unfolding with perfect precision. The main Crusader army was still far away. The Leper King, the symbol of Jerusalem's leadership, had effectively trapped himself. A small detachment could keep Baldwin contained while the rest of the army swept onward to seize the true prize, Jerusalem. As far as Saladin was concerned, the war was already won. Victory felt so certain he could practically taste it. But certainty breeds arrogance, and arrogance invites disaster. Convinced Baldwin posed no threat, Saladin didn't bother launching a proper siege. Why waste time? Why commit forces to an enemy already defeated in spirit and position? Instead, he left a small blockading force at Ascalon, just enough to keep Baldwin pinned, and marched the bulk of his army north toward the Holy City. Yet this decision, born from supreme confidence, opened the door to his downfall. As the army advanced, discipline began to erode. Soldiers spread out across the countryside, looting the rich lands around Ramla, Lydda, and Arsuf. What had marched as a unified machine began to unravel into scattered raiding bands more interested in plunder than maintaining formation. Saladin, riding at the head of a force he believed invincible, was effectively marching blind through enemy territory. Inside Ascalon, however, the Crusaders were far from defeated. They were watching, calculating, waiting. Their numbers suddenly grew stronger when about 80 Knights Templar arrived, joining Baldwin's forces like a blade sharpening another blade. These Templars were the most disciplined heavy cavalry in Christendom, men trained to ride into death without hesitation. From the fortress walls, they observed Saladin's army passing, disorganized, complacent, stretched thin across miles of countryside. They saw the lazy spacing between units, the careless looting, the lack of scouts, the total confidence that no enemy would dare challenge them. They saw weakness hiding in success. And with each passing hour, Baldwin, the Templars, and the Crusader commanders began to understand the truth. The greatest army in the Middle East had left itself open for a killing blow. All they needed was the courage to strike. And Baldwin, sick, exhausted, and barely able to feel his own hands, had courage enough for 10 kings. Baldwin struck with precision and audacity that defied belief. The Crusaders burst from the fortress of Ascalon, linking seamlessly with the Knights Templar who had waited nearby, and began shadowing Saladin's massive, dispersed army as it continued northward. The desert sun glinted off armor, the banners snapping in the wind like warning flames, as the smaller force moved swiftly, observing, calculating, and choosing the perfect moment to strike. Their patience paid off when they discovered the ideal terrain near Manjizar, a hill and surrounding marshes that would force Saladin's unwieldy columns into narrow bottlenecks, turning numbers into a disadvantage. On November 25th, the battle began, and what followed would be recorded in history as one of the greatest underdog victories of all time. Baldwin, despite his sickness and pain, rode at the head of his knights, hands bandaged, body frail, but mind and spirit blazing. The Christian forces formed a dense, unstoppable wedge, the Templars at the tip like a spear aimed straight at the heart of Saladin's unprepared army. The impact was immediate and catastrophic. The Abid army, caught marching through difficult terrain, unready and overconfident, shattered under the charge. Panic rippled through the ranks. Command disintegrated. Saladin's vanguard collapsed almost instantly, and even his elite Mamluk guard was thrown into desperate melee to protect their sultan. His nephew, Ahmad, was killed in the chaos. What should have been a victory march toward Jerusalem turned into a 12-mile rout, a slaughter in which the pursuing Crusaders showed no mercy. Heavy rains fell, local Bedouin tribes attacked the scattered survivors, and Saladin himself narrowly escaped on a camel, humiliated and broken, retreating across the desert toward Cairo. Only a fraction of his once great army survived, the remainder captured or killed. Baldwin, the boy king crippled by leprosy, emerged as a living legend, a symbol of courage, leadership, and tactical genius. Jerusalem gained a decade of precious breathing room, morale soared, and Saladin's aura of invincibility was forever tarnished. The Battle of Manjizar was not a miracle in the divine sense. It was a masterclass in strategy, timing, and indomitable will, proof that even a dying boy could alter the course of history when courage met opportunity. Though Saladin would return 10 years later to exact revenge at Hattin, Manjizar remained Baldwin's immortal triumph, a testament to how intelligence, bravery, and resolve could turn the impossible into